When a modern woman dies after a lifetime in a bitterly broken home, she reincarnates into the warm, amniotic sanctuary of a womb. But there's a catch. She is the unborn child of Lady Mei, the tragic second female lead, and Lord Shen, the villain of a popular ancient Chinese web novel. According to the original plot, the manipulative heroine is destined to cause Mei to miscarry, shattering the fragile political marriage, and sending Lord Shen on a path of blood and ruin. Refusing to let her only chance at a whole, loving family slip away, the fetal protagonist resolves to kick, roll, and scheme her way into the world. She will play matchmaker from the womb, defeat the White Lotus heroine, and ensure her parents get the romantic happily ever after they deserve. They say love is unpredictable, and today's story proves it. Welcome to Romance Crave Stories, where every episode is full of passion, secrets, and emotional twists. Let's begin. Consciousness returned not with a blinding flash of light, but with a slow, rhythmic thumping. Batum, batum. It was a soothing, deeply resonant sound that echoed through the warm, liquid darkness surrounding me. For a long while I simply floated. My mind felt delightfully sluggish, wrapped in a cocoon of safety. I tried to stretch my limbs, only to find them incredibly heavy and strangely proportioned. My arms felt too short, my head too large, and when I bumped my foot against a soft, yielding wall, a muffled gasp echoed from somewhere far above me. "Oh my," a gentle melodic voice murmured. A warm pressure pressed against the wall just millimeters from my floating foot. "You are quite active today, little one." "Wait, little one." I blinked, or at least I tried to. My eyelids felt sealed shut. Panic, sharp and sudden, pierced through the tranquil haze. I wasn't just floating in a random pool of water. I was in a womb. I was a fetus. The memories of my past life came rushing back like a harsh, bitter tide. I remembered the small, cramped apartment filled with the sounds of screaming. My parents had fought constantly, over money, over chores, over the very fact that they breathed the same air. I grew up hiding in closets, my hands pressed over my ears, wishing for a family that sat around a dinner table without throwing plates at the wall. My childhood was a battlefield, and my adulthood wasn't much better. I had isolated myself, working grueling 90-hour weeks at a corporate job, until my heart simply gave out at my desk. I had died alone, having never known what a loving, functional family felt like. "Is the child bothering you, Mei?" A new voice spoke. It was a man's voice, deep, resonant, and laced with an icy authority that made the amniotic fluid vibrate around me. "No, my lord," the woman Mei replied softly. Her tone was respectful, formal, and painfully distant. "The physician said the movements are a sign of good health. I am merely surprised." "Humph. See that you rest. The imperial court is treacherous enough without me having to worry about my heir." "Mei, my lord? Imperial court?" My tiny, developing brain spun. Those names, that dynamic. It was frighteningly familiar. In my past life, my only escape from my miserable reality had been reading web novels. One in particular had stuck with me, The Lotus Pavilion Secret. It was a frustratingly dramatic story set in an ancient Chinese empire. The villain of the story was Lord Shen, a ruthless, cold-blooded minister of the left. His wife was Lady Mei, the elegant but tragic second female lead. Their marriage was purely political, a cold arrangement devoid of affection. And according to the plot, Lady Mei was pregnant with his child. I gave a tiny, frantic kick. I am that child. The realization hit me with the force of a carriage crash. If I was Lady Mei and Lord Shen's unborn baby, I was doomed. In the novel, the heroine, a manipulative White Lotus, named Lady Hua, was deeply jealous of Lord Shen's rising power and Lady Mei's status. Under the guise of friendship, Hua invited Mei to a garden pavilion, where she accidentally slipped and pushed the pregnant Mei into a freezing lotus pond. The fall and the cold caused a devastating miscarriage. The loss of the child completely shattered the fragile, unspoken bond that had been forming between Mei and Shen. Blaming each other, their marriage violently dissolved. Lord Shen, pushed over the edge by grief, became a true, irredeemable villain, eventually being executed by the male lead. Mei, broken and alone, faded away in a remote monastery. No, absolutely not. I waved my tiny, translucent fists in the warm fluid. I had spent my entire previous life trapped in a dysfunctional, broken home. I had finally been given a second chance, a ticket to a fresh start with parents who, underneath all their formal posturing, secretly cared for each other. I was not going to let some scheming, annoying heroine ruin my family before I was even born. I would not be a tragic plot device. I would not be a miscarriage statistic. I needed a plan. I was currently a fetus, which severely limited my options. I couldn't speak, I couldn't walk, and I certainly couldn't slap Lady Hua across the face. But I had one major advantage. I had front row seats to my mother's daily life, and I could communicate through the only method available to me, kicking. I focused all my tiny strength and delivered a solid, purposeful jab to the uterine wall. Batum. Batum. Lady Mei gasped again, her hand flying to her belly. The warmth of her palm radiated through the barrier, soothing and maternal. I pressed my tiny hand against the spot where hers rested. Don't worry, mother, I promised silently into the dark. I will be born safely. I will force Dad to admit his feelings for you. And if that annoying heroine comes anywhere near us, I will make sure she deeply regrets it. I am going to have a whole, happy family, and nothing is going to stop me. Chapter 1. Life as a fetus was, quite frankly, incredibly boring. Once you got past the initial existential crisis of reincarnation, there wasn't much to do besides practice flexing my tiny fingers and eavesdropping on the outside world. My hearing had developed surprisingly well over the last few months, which meant I had a front row seat to the most awkward, painfully stilted marriage in the history of the Yen Empire. Every evening, right around the time the incense clock burned down to the hour of the monkey, the heavy doors of my mother's courtyard would slide open. I could recognize the sharp, precise footfalls of Lord Shen anywhere, his boots clacking against the polished wood like a metronome of doom. My lord, Lady Mei would say, her voice as smooth and polite as polished jade. And just as cold. Lady Mei, have you eaten your evening meal? Yes. The kitchen prepared bird's nest soup, along with braised carp. Good. The imperial physician says it is nourishing. And then silence. An agonizing, suffocating silence. It was unbearable. In my past life, I had seen quarterly corporate earnings reports with more romantic chemistry. If they kept this up, the tragic plot of the Lotus Pavilion's secret was guaranteed to unfold without a hitch. Lord Shen would remain a distant iceberg, and my poor mother would be left emotionally isolated. Easy pickings for the villainous White Lotus, Lady Hua. They desperately needed an icebreaker. Unfortunately, since I lacked vocal cords and was currently submerged in amniotic fluid, I had to improvise. One crisp autumn evening, the silence was particularly agonizing. The crackle of the charcoal brazier in the corner of the room was the only sound breaking the tension. Shen had asked about her embroidery progress, received a one-word answer, and the conversation had completely flatlined. All right, Dad, I thought, winding up my tiny leg. Time to break the ice. I unleashed a furious combination of kicks and rolls, aiming precisely where I knew the uterine wall was thinnest. It was the fetal equivalent of a martial arts routine. Take that. And a left hook. And a somersault. Lady Mei gasped suddenly. Through the muted barrier, I felt her jolt, her hands instinctively flying to her belly to cradle me. The sound of a heavy wooden chair scraping violently across the floorboards echoed into my watery chamber. Shen had moved so fast he practically teleported. Mei! What is it? Is it the child? Shall I summon the physician? His voice, usually a flat, monotone that made hardened court officials tremble, was entirely frantic. No, Mei breathed, her voice trembling slightly. It is just, the baby is very active tonight. It surprised me. Active? Shen hovered. I could sense his massive presence right outside the wall, his usual composure completely shattered by a few kicks from a creature the size of a melon. Now's my chance. I paused my assault, waiting for the perfect moment. May I? Shen asked, his voice dropping to a hesitant whisper that sounded utterly foreign coming from the Empire's most ruthless villain. Yes, Mei replied softly. A large, warm hand pressed cautiously against my mother's stomach. The heat radiated through the skin and fluid, incredibly comforting. I swam toward the warmth, aligning my tiny, developing foot right against the center of his palm, and gave a gentle, deliberate push. That. Above me, Lord Shen inhaled sharply. Heavens, he murmured, his voice cracking with an emotion that sounded dangerously close to awe. I felt it. I felt the kick. The physician says it means the baby is strong, Mei said, her tone softening considerably. I could practically hear the blush rising to her cheeks at his close proximity. Strong, Shen repeated, letting out a low, breathy chuckle. Of course. A child of the Shen household would be. He didn't move his hand away. In fact, he sat right there on the edge of her chaise couch, his thumb gently stroking her stomach. Mei didn't pull away or retreat behind her wall of icy politeness. I drifted back into the center of my cozy apartment, feeling incredibly smug. The emotionally constipated villain was currently melting over a tiny high five, and the Ice Queen mother was leaning into his touch. Phase 1 of the Matchmaker Fetus Protocol was a resounding success. Chapter 2. The gentle progress of my parents' relationship was the single bright spot in the otherwise monotonous life of a developing fetus. After the communicative kick incident, Lord Shen practically lived in my mother's courtyard. The oppressive silence had been replaced by the low, rumbling timbre of his voice reading poetry or discussing safe, non-treasonous court gossip. Lady Mei, in turn, had begun to smile, a soft, genuine expression that made her breathtakingly beautiful. However, my cozy little bubble of domestic bliss was about to be threatened. I was roughly 7 months along when the original heroine finally made her first move. I recognized Lady Hua the moment she spoke. Her voice was like bells chiming in a gentle breeze. High, sweet, and entirely artificial. In the novel, Lady Hua was described as a flawless White Lotus. A woman so seemingly pure and delicate that men tripped over themselves to protect her. In reality, she was a manipulative social climber who saw Lord Shen's rising power as her personal ticket to the top, and my mother as an inconvenient obstacle. Sister Mei, Hua crooned, her voice dripping with fake concern as she entered the sitting room. I was so worried when I heard about your delicate condition. I brought you something special to help restore your vitality. Through the thin barrier of my mother's skin, I heard the clinking of fine porcelain. You are too kind, Lady Hua, Mei replied, her tone perfectly polite but lacking the warmth she now reserved for my father. But the imperial physician has me on a strict regimen. Oh, but this is a rare herbal blend from the southern provinces. Hua insisted, pouring the liquid. It is specifically brewed for expectant mothers to ease their burdens. Please, just one sip, sister. I brewed it myself, with you in my thoughts. Alarm bells began shrieking in my tiny, developing brain. I remembered this scene from the Lotus Pavilion's secret. The tea wasn't for vitality, it was laced with a slow-acting, nearly undetectable abortifacient. In the original plot, Mei had drunk it out of politeness, leading to days of agonizing cramps that ultimately left her too weak to survive the later plunge into the lotus pond. Oh, absolutely not, I fumed. Not on my watch, you plastic houseplant. As I felt my mother hesitate, I knew I had to act fast. I didn't have hands to swat the cup away, but I had total control over my mother's internal real estate. I braced my tiny feet against the bottom of my sack and executed the most violent, thrashing somersault I could muster. I followed it up by pressing my head firmly against what I sincerely hoped was her stomach. The reaction was instantaneous. Mei let out a sudden, strangled gasp. Oh, her hand flew to her mouth. The porcelain teacup slipped from her trembling fingers. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp crash, shattering into a dozen pieces. The hot, dark liquid splattered across the floorboards, and almost immediately, a faint, unnatural hissing sound could be heard as the potent herbs reacted with the wood polish. Sister Mei, Hua cried, taking a hurried step back to protect her silk skirts. What is the meaning of this? I worked for hours. What is the meaning of what? The temperature in the room plummeted by 10 degrees. Lord Shen stood in the doorway, his dark robes swirling around him like a storm cloud. His sharp eyes immediately took in my mother, who was pale and clutching her stomach, and then dropped to the ruined tea hissing on the floor. My lord, Hua simpered, immediately dropping into a graceful curtsy. Her eyes filled with entirely fake tears. I only brought Sister Mei some tea for her health, and she threw it upon the floor. I fear she dislikes me. Shen ignored her completely, crossing the room in 2 massive strides to kneel by my mother. Mei, are you unwell? Is it the child? I am fine, Mei breathed, her nausea passing as I settled back down into a calm float. A sudden wave of sickness. The tea, the smell was overwhelming. Shen's eyes darkened. He stood up, towering over the trembling Lady Hua. He didn't yell. He didn't raise his voice. He simply pointed to the door. Take your things and leave my estate, Lady Hua, he commanded, his voice dripping with ice. If you ever bring unknown substances near my wife again, I will have the Imperial Guards escort you to the dungeons. Do not test me. Hua turned a sickly shade of gray. Spluttering apologies, she gathered her skirts and fled the courtyard like a startled pheasant. Shen immediately called for the servants to clean the mess and summoned the physician to examine the spilled liquid. As he sat back down beside my mother, pulling her gently against his side to soothe her lingering shock, I did a tiny, victorious wiggle. The villainous plot had been thwarted, the White Lotus was banished, and my parents were cuddling. It was a very good day to be a fetus. Chapter 3. Having successfully neutralized the first assassination attempt on my unformed life, I decided it was time to move on to my primary objective. Aggressive, unapologetic matchmaking. Lord Shen had officially banished Lady Hua from my mother's courtyard, which was a fantastic victory. However, simply removing the villainess wasn't enough. In my past life, I had learned the hard way that a lack of direct conflict did not equal a happy home. Apathy and distance could destroy a family just as thoroughly as screaming matches. If I wanted a genuinely loving environment to grow up in, I needed my parents to be hopelessly, sickeningly in love with each other. It was time to employ a little classical conditioning. If Ivan Pavlov could train a dog with a bell, I could certainly train an ancient Chinese supervillain with a few well-timed kicks. The rules of my game were simple. Rule 1. Distance equals distress. Whenever Lord Shen entered the room and chose to sit at his heavy mahogany desk, a good 10 feet away from my mother's plush daybed, I would immediately begin a routine of restless, uncomfortable gymnastics. I wouldn't kick hard enough to cause Mei actual pain, just enough to make her sigh, shift her weight, and rub her lower back with a slight frown. Rule 2. Proximity equals peace. The moment Shen's overprotective instincts kicked in, and he abandoned his desk to sit beside her, I would cease all movement. If he placed his hand on her stomach or wrapped his arm around her waist to offer support, I would radiate, zen-like tranquility, settling into the warm fluid like a perfectly contented little dumpling. The first time I implemented the protocol, it worked flawlessly. Shen had just returned from the imperial court, looking particularly brooding. He seated himself at his desk, unrolling a bamboo scroll with a heavy sigh. Across the room, Mei was quietly embroidering. Unacceptable, I thought. Engage protocol. I began to roll, pressing my little elbows outward and executing a series of rhythmic, annoying hiccups. Mei paused her needlework, letting out a soft, strained exhale. She shifted awkwardly on her cushions, a delicate hand coming to rest on her abdomen. Across the room, the minister of the left froze. He dropped his expensive ink brush, utterly indifferent to the black stain rapidly blooming across his official documents. Mei, is the child restless? A little, she admitted softly. Shen was across the room in a heartbeat. He sank onto the edge of the daybed, his imposing frame taking up most of the space. He carefully reached out, his large, calloused hand hovering before gently settling over the spot where I was currently doing the backstroke. Instantly I stopped. I curled into a tight, peaceful ball right beneath his palm. Shen exhaled a breath he seemed to have been holding. Better? He asked, his voice a low, rumbling vibration that I found incredibly soothing. Much, Mei whispered. I could feel her heart rate steadying, a comfortable warmth spreading through her, as she leaned instinctively into his solid presence. Within 2 weeks, my conditioning had completely rewired the most feared man in the Yen Empire. Lord Shen didn't even bother attempting to use his desk anymore. The moment he entered the courtyard, he made a beeline for my mother. It became a nightly routine. Mei would recline on her daybed, and Shen would sit flush against her, serving as a highly lethal, ridiculously overqualified backrest. The best part was the reading. Since he was now permanently stationed beside her, he began bringing his work over. And because sitting in silence while physically glued to someone was entirely too awkward, he started reading the documents aloud. The southern province reports a surplus of grain, though the river tolls remain contested. Shen's deep, baritone voice would vibrate through my watery world, functioning as the weirdest, most bureaucratic lullaby ever conceived. I shall have to order the local magistrate audited. You shouldn't be too harsh, my lord, Mei would murmur, her head resting on his shoulder. The spring rains were heavy. The roads might be impassable. Humph. Perhaps. I will send a missive instead of the guard. I floated in the dark, practically glowing with smug satisfaction. Yes, the butcher of the Northern Rebellion was currently taking administrative advice from his wife, while using her pregnant belly as a reading desk. The cold, political marriage was completely dead, replaced by a quiet, profound partnership. The original plot was officially in shambles, and I was going to be born into the most obnoxiously affectionate family in the empire. Chapter 4. As my 8th month of gestation approached, my cramped, watery apartment was getting noticeably smaller. My kicks were no longer cute little flutters. They were heavy, deliberate thumps that occasionally made my mother wince. But despite the lack of space, I was content. Lord Shen and Lady Mei were practically inseparable, radiating a disgusting amount of marital bliss. However, the universe, or perhaps the stubborn mechanics of the original novel's plot, was not entirely finished with us. Lady Hua, the banished White Lotus, was growing desperate. Her opportunity arose during the annual winter solstice banquet. Since the event was hosted by the imperial family in the palace's grand gardens, Lord Shen could not simply bar her from attending. He was forced to leave my mother's side for a brief meeting with the emperor, leaving Mei to rest on a carved stone bench near the infamous imperial lotus pond. Even through the amniotic fluid, I could feel the chill in the air. Winter had officially arrived, and the pond beside us was a freezing expanse of dark water and dying lily pads. Sister Mei, a sickeningly familiar, sugary voice chimed. I immediately stiffened. Oh, you have got to be kidding me. Doesn't this woman have any other hobbies? Lady Hua, my mother replied, her tone as frigid as the winter air. She did not stand to greet her. It is so lovely to see you out and about, Hua purred, her silk slippers crunching softly against the frosty gravel as she stepped dangerously close. Though I must say, sitting so near the water's edge in your delicate condition seems terribly reckless. I could hear the malicious intent dripping from every word. This was the moment. The grand climax of the original novel's tragedy. Hua was going to pretend to trip, push my mother into the freezing water, and trigger the catastrophic miscarriage that would tear my parents apart. Not today, Satan, I thought, bracing myself. I maneuvered my cramped limbs, pressing my back against one side of my mother's womb, and planting both of my feet firmly against the other. I gathered every ounce of strength my tiny, 8-month-old muscles possessed. I am perfectly fine, Lady Hua, Mei said calmly. If you will excuse me, I believe my husband is returning. Oh, but wait. There is a smudge of ash on your cloak. Hua lunged. I could hear the sharp intake of her breath, the rustle of her heavy winter robes as she threw her weight forward, hands extended toward my mother's shoulders. I didn't hesitate. I pushed off with my feet, delivering a massive, violent kick directly into my mother's lower ribs. Mei cried out, the sudden, sharp shock completely overriding her balance. She flinched violently, stumbling backward away from the bench and out of Hua's direct path. With her target suddenly gone, Lady Hua's momentum betrayed her. Her outstretched hands grasped nothing but empty winter air. I heard a very undignified, high-pitched shriek, followed by the heavy splash of expensive silk hitting freezing, muddy water. Silence descended on the gardens, broken only by the sound of frantic splashing and sputtering. Help! Help me! Hua shrieked, her sweet facade completely washed away by the icy, foul-smelling pond water. She thrashed wildly, tangling herself in the dead, rotting lotus stems. Heavy, urgent footsteps pounded down the gravel path. Mei! Lord Shen's voice boomed, thick with panic. I am all right, my lord, my mother answered, though her voice shook slightly as she watched the spectacle in the water. The baby gave a rather strong kick. I stepped back just as Lady Hua lost her footing. Shen stopped beside my mother, his arm immediately wrapping around her waist in a vice-like grip, pulling her away from the water's edge. He looked down at the freezing, mud-soaked heroine currently spitting out duckweed. His expression was a mask of murderous disdain. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't call for a towel. He simply looked at the imperial guards who had come running at the commotion. Fish her out, Shen ordered, his voice echoing coldly across the frosty gardens. And then escort her back to her family's estate. Inform her father that if his daughter ever steps within 50 paces of my wife again, I will personally ensure his entire lineage spends the rest of their days guarding the frozen northern borders. As the guards dragged the sobbing, shivering, mud-caked Lady Hua away, Shen turned his attention back to my mother, his cold eyes instantly softening into warm, frantic worry as he checked her over for any injuries. Floating safely in my dark, cozy home, I gave a gentle, contented wiggle. The Lotus Pond incident was officially conquered. The tragedy was averted. Now there was nothing left to do but make my grand entrance. Chapter 5. My cozy, aquatic apartment was officially evicting me. It started deep in the night with a slow, rhythmic squeezing sensation that pushed me downward. At first, it was just mildly uncomfortable, like the walls of my home were giving me a very firm hug. But as the hours ticked by, the hugs turned into vice-like contractions that left me with absolutely zero room to maneuver. The warm fluid that had been my constant companion for 9 months began to drain away, and the pressure on my surprisingly large head became intense. The time had come. I was breaking out. Outside, however, the situation sounded less like a miracle of life and more like a hostile military siege. Lord Shen, the unshakable minister of the left, had completely and utterly lost his mind. More hot water. Why is she still in pain? Do something, you useless wretches. His voice thundered through the heavy wooden doors of the bedchamber, rattling the very foundations of the estate. And my lord, a midwife stammered, her voice shaking violently. It is a natural process. The lady is progressing well, but we must be patient. Patient? Shen roared. I could hear the sharp, metallic shing of a sword being drawn from its scabbard a few inches. If my wife or my child suffers any undue harm because of your incompetence, I will mount all of your heads on the city gates. Do you understand me? Shen, my mother gasped, her voice tight with pain but laced with an undeniable authority. The sound of the sword sliding back into its sheath was instantaneous. I am here, Mei, Shen said, his voice dropping from a roar to a desperate, frantic whisper as he hurried to her bedside. I am right here. Stop threatening the midwives, Mei ordered, letting out a sharp breath as another contraction gripped us both. I tried to make myself as small and aerodynamic as possible to help her out. They cannot deliver the baby if they are terrified of being executed. Sit down. Give me your hand. There was a heavy thud as the most feared man in the Yan Empire dropped onto a stool beside the bed, instantly obeying her command. Now, Mei said, her breathing heavy and labored. Do not let go. The next few hours were a grueling marathon of intense pressure, exhausted gasps, and the continuous, soothing rumble of my father's voice trying to calm my mother. Whenever the pain seemed too much, I would feel the tight grip of Shen's hand through the frantic energy of the room, grounding her. I did my best to push along with her contractions, determined to make this as quick as possible. Come on, I cheered silently, shoving my tiny shoulders forward. We can do this. Push. With one final, monumental effort from my mother, the tight, suffocating pressure suddenly vanished. I slid out of the dark and into the world. The transition was a massive shock to the system. The air was freezing against my wet skin, and the sudden, blinding assault of candlelight forced my eyes tightly shut. I opened my mouth, my tiny lungs expanding for the very first time, and let out a furious, ear-piercing wail to announce my grand arrival. A girl! One of the midwives cried out, her voice weeping with relief, likely because she got to keep her head attached to her neck. My lord, my lady, it is a healthy, beautiful girl. I was quickly wiped down with warm, soft cloths and wrapped securely in a thick layer of fine crimson silk. The wailing was exhausting, so I quieted down to a soft, disgruntled hiccup as I was gently transferred into a pair of trembling arms. I managed to peel my heavy eyelids open. My mother looked down at me. Her hair was plastered to her forehead with sweat, and she looked entirely exhausted, but her eyes were bright with tears of joy. She pressed a gentle, lingering kiss to my forehead. Look at her, she whispered, her voice cracking. A massive shadow leaned over us. Lord Shen looked at me as if I were a mythical creature that had just materialized in his bedroom. The hard, ruthless lines of his face were completely gone. His dark eyes were wide, taking in my tiny, red face and the wisps of dark hair on my head. He reached out a single, trembling finger, gently stroking my cheek. Instinctively, I reached out and wrapped my tiny hand around the tip of his finger, holding on tight. Shen inhaled sharply, a tear slipping down the fearsome villain's face. Ling, he murmured softly, bestowing my name with a reverence usually reserved for the gods. Our little Ling. I let out a contented sigh and closed my eyes, drifting off to sleep to the sound of my parents' synchronized, steady heartbeats. The hard part was over. I had successfully been born into a loving, whole family. Now the real fun could begin. Chapter 6. Growing up as the beloved, fiercely protected daughter of the Yan Empire's most feared minister was a highly entertaining, an incredibly educational experience. By my third birthday, I had learned a very important universal truth. Immense political power, a terrifying reputation, and a heart of ice were absolutely no match for a toddler's weaponized pout. My father, Lord Shen, was known as the Butcher of the Northern Rebellion. He was a man who could supposedly freeze blood with a single glare and ruin aristocratic families with a flick of his ink brush. But to me, he was just Dad. A massive brooding softy who was utterly defenseless against my big, watery eyes. Naturally, as a mentally mature adult trapped in a 3-year-old's body, I used my immense power for good. Mostly. The imperial court quickly caught on to the shifting dynamics of the Shen household. In the past, government officials had attempted to appease my terrifying father with bribes of rare tea, expensive calligraphic scrolls, or beautiful concubines, the latter of which Shen had always coldly rejected. Now the bribery system had undergone a drastic, adorable overhaul. "My lord," a nervous, sweating magistrate stammered one afternoon, bowing so low his forehead practically scraped the stone tiles of our courtyard. "The Eastern Province submits its tax reports, and a humble gift for the young miss." From his trembling hands, he produced a beautifully carved wooden horse with articulated joints and a mane of real horsehair. My father's terrifying, icy glare paused. He looked at the toy, then down at me, where I was currently clinging to his pant leg, attempting to look as small and endearing as possible. I let out an excited, high-pitched gasp and reached out with grabby hands. Shen sighed, the hard lines around his mouth softening into a faint, barely perceptible smirk. "The Eastern Province's reports will be reviewed favorably," he declared, snatching the wooden horse and handing it down to me. "Dismissed." The magistrate practically wept with relief as he backed out of the courtyard. Within a month, my playroom looked like a high-end imperial toy shop, funded entirely by terrified bureaucrats desperately trying to avoid my father's political wrath. However, my most important duty as Daddy's little manipulator wasn't securing loot. It was preserving his mental health and, by extension, the peace of my family. Despite the happy turn of events, Shen was still the minister of the left. His job was stressful, dangerous, and required navigating a treacherous sea of political vipers. There were evenings when he would lock himself in his study, the dark energy rolling off him in waves as he drafted ruthless counter-strategies that bordered on the villainous tendencies of his novel counterpart. Whenever I sensed the dark, brooding aura taking over, it was my cue to deploy. I would waddle up to the heavy oak doors of his study and push them open just enough to squeeze my small frame through. The room would be dimly lit, thick with tension, and my father would be hunched over his desk, rubbing his temples, looking one bad day away from ordering an execution. "Daddy," I would chirp, clutching my new wooden horse. Shen's head would snap up, the dark, murderous glint in his eyes instantly evaporating the second he saw me. "Ling, what are you doing out of bed? It is late." "Can't sleep." I would lie smoothly, toddling over to his desk and raising my arms. "Up, please." He never said no. He would scoop me up with one massive arm, settling me onto his lap right on top of his highly sensitive, confidential state documents. I would immediately grab his most expensive, silver-handled ink brush and begin cheerfully painting on a scrap piece of bamboo. "Ling, those are the military budget proposals," he would try to scold, though there was zero heat behind it. "Horse," I would announce, holding up my messy scribble of ink that looked absolutely nothing like an equine creature. "For you." The tension in his broad shoulders would break. A deep, rumbling laugh would vibrate through his chest, a sound that always made my mother smile from the hallway, where I knew she was secretly watching. He would set down his work, wrap his arms around me, and rest his chin on top of my head. "Thank you, little one," he would murmur softly. The dark, brooding villain from the book was completely gone. In his place was a doting father who actively rearranged his lethal political schedules, avoided unnecessary bloodshed, and let minor treason slide. All just so he could be home in time to have dinner with his wife and read a bedtime story to his daughter. Chapter 7. The Yen Empire's annual Mid-Autumn Banquet was a dazzling display of wealth, power, and thinly veiled political backstabbing. The Grand Palace Hall was illuminated by thousands of painted lanterns, casting a warm, golden glow over the aristocrats who were busy plotting each other's downfalls between sips of osmanthus wine. I was currently 3 years old, dressed in a ridiculously adorable miniature gown of crimson and gold silk. I sat securely on my father's lap at one of the highest tables of honor, swinging my small legs and happily chewing on a candied plum. Beside us, my mother, Lady Mei, looked absolutely radiant in a sweeping dress of midnight blue, gracefully accepting the polite greetings from passing nobles. Life was good. The plot was derailed. My parents were hopelessly in love. Or so I thought. I had underestimated the sheer, terrifying persistence of a web novel heroine, whose storyline had been aggressively hijacked. I hadn't seen Lady Hua since the glorious, muddy conclusion of the Lotus Pond incident. Following my father's lethal threat, her family had kept her locked away in their outer estate. But apparently, cockroaches were notoriously difficult to get rid of. Through some stroke of manipulative genius, or perhaps by clinging to the coattails of a gullible relative, she had managed to secure an invitation to the banquet. I spotted her weaving through the tables, her eyes locked onto our little family unit like a heat-seeking missile. She was dressed in pure, innocent white, a stark contrast to the rich autumn colors worn by the rest of the court, and her face was perfectly painted to look pale and tragic. Oh, here we go, I thought, dropping my candied plum and going on high alert. Hua timed her approach perfectly. She waited for a lull in the lively palace music, ensuring that the surrounding tables of high-ranking officials and their gossiping wives were well within earshot. Lord Shen, Hua said softly. Her voice trembled with the exact right frequency of suppressed heartbreak. My father didn't even look up from peeling a lychee for my mother. You are blocking the lantern light, Lady Hua. Move. A few nobles at the adjacent tables snickered, but Hua was undeterred. She pressed a delicate lace handkerchief to her eyes, forcing a single crystalline tear to fall. I only wish to offer my greetings to you and Sister Mei, Hua sniffled, raising her voice just a fraction so the surrounding aristocrats would definitely hear. It warms my heart to see you both so happy. Truly. Even if it brings back painful memories of the past. My mother set down her teacup, her elegant brow arching coldly. The past, Lady Hua? I try not to think of it, Sister Mei, Hua continued, her voice projecting beautifully across the suddenly quiet hall. I know it was the Emperor's will that you marry Lord Shen, a political necessity for the stability of the realm. I have long since accepted that his original promises to my family had to be broken. I bear you no ill will for taking my place as his bride, even if it left my own heart shattered. A collective, sharp intake of breath echoed from the neighboring tables. Wow, I thought, genuinely impressed by the sheer audacity. That is some top-tier, manipulative garbage. It was a brilliantly calculated move. By framing my mother as the politically mandated second choice, who had stolen Shen away from his true, tragically abandoned love, Hua was attempting to completely destroy my mother's reputation and social standing in high society. She wanted everyone to believe Shen's current devotion was just a public act to cover up a tragic romance. My father's grip on the table edge tightened so severely the wood groaned. The murderous, villainous aura he had kept suppressed for 3 years exploded outward, chilling the air in the immediate vicinity. He was preparing to stand up and likely commit a felony right there in front of the Emperor. But I couldn't let him ruin his political career over a plastic houseplant. This required a toddler's touch. I looked down at the table. Right in front of me sat a silver bowl of 8 treasure sticky rice porridge. It was a festive delicacy, thick, heavy, covered in crushed nuts, and held together by a syrup so dense it could double as architectural mortar. Moving with the lightning speed fueled by 3 years of pent-up annoyance, I grabbed the heavy silver bowl with both of my chubby hands. I stood up on my father's thighs, leaned back, and hurled the bowl with every ounce of strength my little body possessed. Splat. My aim was flawless. The heavy mass of sticky rice, syrup, and crushed walnuts struck Lady Hua directly in the center of her tragically pale face. The sheer force of the porridge knocked her perfectly pinned hair loose. Thick, sugary syrup immediately glued her eyelashes shut, and began dripping in heavy globs down the front of her pristine, innocent white silk dress. The entire grand hall went dead silent. The music stopped. Hundreds of nobles stared in open-mouthed shock. Lady Hua stood frozen, looking like a victim of a very festive artillery strike. A single candied cherry slid slowly off her nose and dropped onto the floor with a soft plop. I sat back down on my father's lap, blinked my large, innocent eyes, and let out a bright, cheerful giggle. Oops, I announced loudly, pointing a chubby finger at the sticky mess. Slipped. Beside me, my mother quickly pressed her silk sleeve to her mouth, her shoulders shaking with silent, uncontrollable laughter. My father stared at the ruined heroine for a long moment, the murderous tension completely bleeding out of his frame, replaced by profound amusement. Shen calmly reached for a pristine linen napkin and gently wiped a stray drop of syrup from my cheek. He didn't even bother looking at Hua again. My daughter is still learning to control her grip, Shen said, his voice ringing with icy authority across the silent hall. Guards. Lady Hua appears to have had an accident. Escort her out before she soils the palace floors any further. As the sputtering, sticky, and completely humiliated heroine was dragged away by the imperial guards, the surrounding nobles quickly went back to their meals, terrified of catching Shen's eye. I happily accepted another peeled lychee from my father, thoroughly satisfied. Scheme 2.0 was officially terminated, and dessert was served. Chapter 8. Springtime in the capital of the Yen Empire was a vibrant, chaotic explosion of color and sound. The annual Lantern Festival had completely transformed the usually rigid city streets into a sprawling, festive night market. Red silk lanterns hung from every eave, street vendors loudly hawked their wares, and the scent of roasted chestnuts and spiced meats filled the cool evening air. For the average aristocratic family, attending a crowded public festival was considered beneath their dignity. But for my family, it was a mandatory excursion, entirely because I threw a highly calculated, tearless tantrum until my father agreed. My parents were deeply, undeniably in love within the private walls of our estate. But out in public, ingrained noble habits died hard. They walked side by side, maintaining a respectable, agonizing half-foot of distance between them. They spoke in quiet, formal tones. It was infuriatingly proper. As the self-appointed manager of their romance arc, I considered it my professional duty to break down this public formality and force them into classic, undeniably romantic tropes. I was the ultimate, hyper-aware third wheel, and I was ready to work. Our first stop was a street vendor selling tonghulu, candied hawthorn berries skewered on bamboo sticks and coated in a hardened sugar glaze. My father, the terrifying minister of the left whose mere presence was currently making the poor vendor sweat profusely, paid for a skewer and handed it down to me. Careful, Ling, my mother warned softly, her eyes tracking the sticky confection. Do not get it on your sleeves. Oh, I am going to do much worse than that, I plotted. I took 2 steps, ensured we were right in the middle of the crowded thoroughfare where they would have to act quickly, and purposely let my tiny fingers slip. The heavy skewer tumbled toward the cobblestones. Oh no, I gasped softly. In an impressive display of synchronized parental reflexes, both Shen and Mei lunged forward to catch the falling sticky treat before it hit the dirt. Because they were moving toward the same small target, their hands collided perfectly in midair. Shen's large, callous fingers wrapped completely around my mother's delicate, pale hand. They both froze, hunched over the cobblestones. I watched gleefully as a furious blush swept up my mother's neck, illuminating her face under the warm red glow of the lanterns. My father's breath hitched, his thumb instinctively brushing against her knuckles before he cleared his throat and carefully picked up the tonghulu with his free hand. I have it, he murmured, his voice noticeably deeper than it had been a moment ago. He stood up, slowly releasing her hand, but their eyes remained locked for a long, heavy second. The air between them crackled with an electric, entirely unprofessional tension. Nailed it, I thought, happily accepting the rescued candy. Phase 1 was a complete success. An hour later, as the festival crowds grew thicker and the fireworks began to pop over the imperial palace, I decided it was time for Phase 2. Daddy, I whined, dropping my shoulders and employing the ultimate toddler weapon, the boneless slouch. My legs are broken. They do not work anymore. Your legs are not broken, Ling, my mother sighed, though she smiled affectionately. You have been running for an hour. Broken, I insisted, lifting my arms toward my father. Without missing a beat, Shen scooped me up. Now this was the critical maneuver. I squirmed and adjusted my position in his arms until he was forced to shift all my weight to his right side, securely holding me against his chest with his right arm. This left his left hand completely free, and dangling right next to my mother's right hand. As we resumed our walk, the dense crowd surged forward to watch a troop of fire breathers. The crush of people gently pushed my mother closer to my father's side. With a little strategic wobble, from me to throw him slightly off balance, Shen naturally reached out to steady himself. His fingers brushed against Mei's. This time, neither of them pulled away. Slowly, gently, I watched my father's large hand open, his fingers naturally intertwining with my mother's. Mei leaned her shoulder against his arm, a soft, incredibly peaceful smile gracing her lips as they walked through the bustling, noisy market, completely lost in their own private world. From my high vantage point resting on my father's broad shoulder, I rested my chin on my hands and watched the fireworks explode in brilliant showers of gold and green. The sheer, overwhelming warmth of the moment washed over me, tight and secure. In my past life, public outings had been a nightmare of hushed arguments and bitter resentment. I remembered walking 10 paces behind my fighting parents, pretending I didn't know them. But here, wrapped in the safety of my father's arms, watching him hold my mother's hand under the festival lights, every lingering scar from that broken past finally stitched itself shut. I had fought for this family, and looking at them now, radiating quiet, unshakable love, I knew I had won. Chapter 9. The Imperial Spring Hunting Festival was supposed to be a peaceful, aesthetically pleasing event. The royal hunting grounds on the outskirts of the capital were a pastel dream, covered in rolling hills of fresh, matcha green grass and sweeping fields of blooming wild lavender. Noble families set up luxurious, airy pavilions draped in soft white silks, sipping tea and eating delicate pastries glazed with wild strawberries. It was the perfect, relaxing lo-fi atmosphere I thoroughly enjoyed. I was 4 years old now, sitting happily on a woven mat, my hair tied up in 2 little buns secured by soft silk scrunchies. My mother, Lady Mei, looked ethereal in a flowing lilac dress, chatting politely with the other high-ranking aristocratic wives. My father, Lord Shen, was currently deep in the forest with the emperor, fulfilling his mandatory hunting duties while probably wishing he was back at our pavilion napping. The vibe was immaculate. Naturally, the universe decided it was the perfect time for Lady Hua to ruin it. I don't know who she bribed or which distant, gullible relative she manipulated to get an invitation, but there she was. After the sticky rice disaster of the mid-autumn banquet, Hua had lost almost all of her social standing. The high society ladies whispered behind their silk fans whenever she walked by. Desperate to claw her way back up the social ladder, she had apparently decided that her best strategy was to drag my mother down. The ladies had moved toward the edge of a wide, bubbling creek to admire the water lilies. The banks of the creek, however, were comprised of thick, dark, slippery mud left over from the recent spring rains. I was busy trying to catch a butterfly when I noticed Hua sidling up behind my mother. Her eyes were fixed squarely on the back of my mother's pristine lilac dress, and her expression was twisted with bitter jealousy. Oh, absolutely not, I thought, dropping my butterfly net. I watched as Hua took a casual step forward, positioning herself right behind my mother. She cast a quick, furtive glance around to make sure no one was looking directly at her, then deliberately stuck her silk-slippered foot out, aiming right for my mother's ankle. It was a classic underhanded scheme designed to send Mei tumbling face first into the humiliating, filthy mud right in front of the Empire's worst gossips. She had completely forgotten to account for the ankle-biting perimeter guard. Moving with the explosive sugar-fueled speed that only a toddler possesses, I sprinted across the matcha-colored grass. I didn't yell. I didn't warn anyone. I simply lowered my shoulder and launched my entire 30-pound body directly at the back of Lady Hua's knees. Physics is a beautiful thing. When you unexpectedly strike the back of a person's knees, their legs buckle instantly. Hua let out a breathless shriek as her foundation crumbled. Her arms windmilled wildly in the air, trying to catch her balance, but her own momentum from the attempted trip carried her violently forward. She sailed cleanly past my mother, completely clearing the grassy embankment, and landed face first in the center of the deepest, wettest mud pit by the creek. Splat. The heavy, wet sound echoed across the tranquil lavender fields. I immediately threw myself onto the grass, clutching my knee, and unleashed a completely fake, deafening wail. Wah! Mommy! My mother whipped around, her eyes widening in alarm. She rushed over and scooped me up, her soft hands frantically checking my face and arms for injuries. Ling! Ling, what happened? Are you hurt? The scary lady. I sobbed dramatically, burying my face into the crook of her neck, and pointing a chubby finger at the flailing creature in the mud. She bumped into me and stepped on my foot. She knocked me over. The surrounding aristocratic ladies gasped, their fans snapping shut in unison. Bullying a peer was one thing, but physically knocking over a 4-year-old child was a social crime of the highest order. How disgraceful! The Minister of Right's wife whispered loudly. She has completely lost her mind. Another lady agreed, glaring down at the creek. Lady Hua slowly pushed herself up onto her hands and knees. She was a horrifying sight. The thick, dark mud coated her from head to toe, dripping from her nose and ruining her expensive silk robes. She looked like a swamp monster that had crawled out of the deep. I didn't. Hua sputtered, spitting out a mouthful of muddy water. She looked up at the circle of disgusted, glaring noblewomen, and then her eyes locked onto me. Over my mother's shoulder, I stopped crying for exactly 1 second. I looked the ruined heroine dead in the eye, gave her a bright, utterly unrepentant smirk, and then went right back to wailing into my mother's lilac dress. The imperial guards had to escort Hua away wrapped in a burlap sack, so she wouldn't ruin the royal carpets. As my mother gently rubbed my back and fed me a strawberry pastry to soothe my fright, I kicked my feet happily. The plot was secure, the mud pit was victorious, and I was definitely getting extra dessert tonight. Chapter 10. The carriage ride back from the Imperial Spring Hunting Festival was a masterclass in feigned exhaustion. My tiny 4-year-old body was slumped heavily against my father's broad chest, my eyes closed, and my breathing slowed to a perfectly rhythmic, believable cadence. In reality, I was wide awake and buzzing with the triumphant adrenaline of having successfully neutralized the heroine with a tactical mud tackle. When the carriage finally rolled to a halt in the courtyard of the Shen estate, I remained entirely limp. Lord Shen, the fearsome minister of the left, did not hand me off to a servant. Instead, he carefully shifted his grip, supporting my back with one massive hand, and tucking my legs against his side with the other. "I have her," he murmured to my mother, his voice a low, rumbling vibration against my ear. I kept my eyes shut tight as we moved through the quiet corridors of the estate. The evening air was cool, carrying the faint, sweet scent of blooming plum blossoms. Soon, the soft ambient glow of the painted paper lanterns shifted into the darker, tranquil shadows of my nursery. My room was a peaceful, minimalist haven. Eschewing the loud, gaudy golds and heavy reds typical of the empire's aristocracy, my mother had decorated it in soft, soothing pastels, gentle matcha greens and pale lavenders. My father gently lowered me into my small, carved wooden bed. My mother's delicate hands brushed over me next. She carefully untied the thick, soft silk scrunchie that had kept my hair in twin buns all day, smoothing the dark strands across my pillow. Then, she pulled my favorite blanket up to my chin. It was a rare, incredibly plush piece woven from imported Ye wool, dyed a delicate strawberry pink, and it was the softest thing I had ever touched in both of my lives. "She was so brave today," my mother whispered, her fingers lingering gently on my cheek. The rustle of her silk robes indicated she was stepping back, but she didn't leave the room. A heavy, incredibly fond sigh escaped my father. "She takes after you, Mei." "Me." My mother let out a quiet, elegant scoff. I would never have the courage to stand up to Lady Hua like that. I was frozen. When I saw Ling crying on the ground, my heart nearly stopped. I truly thought the woman had trampled her. There was a long, pregnant pause. "Mei," my father said, his voice laced with a profound, perceptive amusement. "Hua did not trample her." "What do you mean?" "We all saw." "I spoke with the imperial guards who fished Lady Hua out of the creek," Shen interrupted gently. "According to their assessment of the footprints in the mud, Hua was lunging toward you, but her momentum was entirely disrupted by a low-angle, high-velocity impact from behind." Underneath my plush Ye wool blanket, I froze completely. Oh no. He knows. The butcher of the Northern Rebellion knows I used military tactics on a civilian. "Are you suggesting," my mother said, her voice dropping to a scandalized whisper, "that our 4-year-old daughter tackled a fully grown woman into a mud pit?" "I am suggesting," Shen replied, the pride swelling so thickly in his voice it was almost palpable, "that our daughter has excellent situational awareness and flawless execution. She neutralized a threat to you before it could even materialize. She is a Shen through and through." I couldn't help it. A tiny, immensely satisfied smile tugged at the corners of my mouth in the dark. "Heavens," Mei breathed, though she didn't sound angry. In fact, she sounded like she was fighting a smile of her own. "She is a menace. We are going to have our hands full when she reaches marrying age." "No one is marrying her," Shen declared immediately, the icy, overprotective villain persona snapping back into place for a split second. "Any boy who looks at her will be exiled to the salt mines." My mother let out a soft, choked laugh. The sound was beautiful, ringing lightly in the quiet nursery. Through my barely opened eyelashes, I watched them. The moonlight streamed through the lattice windows, casting a silver glow over the two of them. They were standing close together, the agonizing half-foot of distance from their public outings completely gone. Shen reached out, his large hands gently cupping my mother's face. His thumbs brushed away a stray tear of laughter from her cheek. "Mei," he said, and all the amusement faded from his voice, replaced by a raw, overwhelming vulnerability. "I know how this began. I know the Emperor's edict was a cage for you. Our marriage was a duty, a cold political calculation meant to secure my loyalty and trap your family. I was a man accustomed only to blood, ambition, and the ruthless arithmetic of the court. I did not know how to be a husband. I certainly did not know how to be a father." My mother's hands came up to rest over his, her eyes shining brightly in the moonlight. She didn't interrupt him. She just listened, her expression open and entirely trusting. "But you changed everything," Shen continued, his voice cracking slightly with the weight of his confession. "You and Ling. You brought light into a life I thought was destined for darkness. The power, the politics, the favor of the Emperor. It all means absolutely nothing to me now. If the court burned to the ground tomorrow, I would not care, as long as I could return home to this room." He leaned his forehead against hers, his breath hitching. "You are my entire world now, Mei. I love you." For a moment, the only sound in the room was the gentle rustling of the plum blossom trees outside the window. Then Mei let out a broken, choked sob. She threw her arms tightly around his neck, burying her face against his broad chest. "I love you too," she wept openly, the final walls of their arranged marriage crumbling to dust. "I was so terrified of you at first. But you are the kindest, gentlest man I have ever known. You are my home, Shen." He wrapped his arms around her waist, lifting her slightly off the floor as he held her tight, burying his face in her dark hair. Underneath my blankets, I pumped both of my tiny fists in an aggressive, silent victory dance. The romance plot was completely, undeniably, permanently secured. The villain had been redeemed by love, the tragic second female lead had found her happily ever after, and the miserable, lonely life I had lived before was officially rewritten. We were finally a real family. Chapter 11. The peace that settled over the Shen estate, following my parents' midnight confession, was absolute. For an entire month, the atmosphere was so sickeningly sweet and idyllic that it felt like we were living inside a soft, pastel-colored painting. My father's rare, genuine smiles became a daily occurrence. My mother's laughter echoed freely through the sunlit courtyards. And I spent my days being thoroughly spoiled by the two most dangerously devoted parents in the Yen Empire. But the universe, and the stubborn, rigid mechanics of a poorly written web novel, hates a vacuum. If the designated villain refuses to act like a villain, and the tragic second female lead refuses to suffer, the plot will simply find another way to force the tragedy. The devastating blow fell on a warm Tuesday afternoon. My father was home early from the capital, sitting on the veranda with my mother, trying to teach me how to hold a calligraphy brush without turning my hands entirely black. The idyllic scene was violently interrupted by the sharp, echoing strike of the estate's heavy bronze gong. A procession of imperial guards marched into the courtyard, led by the emperor's chief eunuch. The eunuch's face was a mask of rigid formality, and in his hands he carried a heavy scroll of bright, unmistakable imperial yellow silk. An imperial edict. My father's relaxed posture vanished in a millisecond. He stood up, towering over the veranda, the icy, cold aura of the Butcher of the Northern Rebellion snapping back into place so fast it gave me whiplash. He stepped protectively in front of my mother, who had gone completely pale, clutching me tightly to her chest. "Lord Shen," the eunuch announced, his voice carrying an annoying nasal pitch. "The Son of Heaven sends his regards and bestows upon you his divine favor." The eunuch unrolled the yellow silk with a dramatic snap and began to read. At first, it was the usual political fluff, praising my father for his ruthless efficiency in handling the southern trade routes and his unwavering loyalty. But then, the wording shifted. The emperor expressed concern over the heavy burdens of my father's household, and the need for balance within the court's noble factions. Therefore, to reward your unmatched service, and to soothe the lingering tensions of the past, the emperor graciously decrees that Lord Shen shall take Lady Hua of the Hua ministry as his honorable secondary wife. The silence that followed was so profound and heavy it felt like all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the courtyard. I stared at the eunuch in utter disbelief. Are you kidding me? Lady Hua's family had actually done it. Stripped of their social standing after the mud incident, they had bypassed the social ladders entirely and gone straight to the top. They had somehow convinced the emperor, who was always overly paranoid about my father's massive influence, that planting a spy disguised as a secondary wife directly into our household was a brilliant political maneuver to keep the Shen family in check. The plot wasn't just trying to creep back into our lives, it was kicking the front door down with the highest authority in the land. The air around my father grew so cold I could see his breath. His hand twitched toward the empty spot on his hip where he usually kept his sword. If he had been armed, the chief eunuch would have been in 2 pieces on the pristine stone tiles. Lord Shen, the eunuch prompted nervously, sweating under the sheer, murderous weight of my father's glare. You must accept the decree. To refuse an imperial edict was the textbook definition of high treason. The punishment was execution, not just for the offender, but for their entire family line. My father didn't bow. He didn't offer thanks. He stared at the eunuch with eyes like dead coals, turned on his heel, and walked straight into his study, slamming the heavy oak door so hard the walls rattled. The next few hours brought a heavy, suffocating tension to our home that I hadn't felt since my past life. My mother sat in the nursery, her face ashen and rocking me back and forth. He will refuse it, she whispered to herself, tears pooling in her beautiful eyes. He is too proud. He will draft a refusal, and the emperor will charge him with treason. We will lose everything. I slipped out of her arms and waddled over to the door of my father's study. Peeking through the crack, I saw him pacing furiously like a caged tiger. The floor was littered with crumpled balls of paper. He was drafting letters of refusal, fully prepared to throw away his career, his status, and potentially his life, rather than let the woman who had tried to murder his wife back into our home. He was going to commit treason for us. Absolutely not, I thought, narrowing my 4-year-old eyes. I had spent my entire existence fighting for this family. I wasn't going to let an insecure emperor and a muddy, manipulative White Lotus destroy it now. If my father couldn't politically reject the edict without being executed, then I would just have to make sure the emperor took it back himself. It was time for the ultimate toddler protest. Chapter 12. The emperor of the Yin Empire was not a man who appreciated being ignored. When 3 days passed without Lord Shen formally accepting the imperial edict to marry Lady Hua, the Son of Heaven decided to take matters into his own hands. Under the guise of a gracious visit to a loyal subject, the royal carriage rolled into our estate, accompanied by a small army of imperial guards and an excessive amount of royal fanfare. The underlying message was clear. Submit to my authority, or I will execute you in your own home. My father was forced to host the emperor in the grand reception hall. He knelt rigidly at the low mahogany table, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. My mother sat slightly behind him, trembling, her face pale. As was customary for an informal royal visit, I was seated on a plush silk cushion next to my mother, dressed in a tiny, perfectly tailored gold and red dress. I looked like a harmless, adorable little dumpling. In reality, I was a 4-year-old ticking time bomb, and I had my finger on the detonator. The emperor, a middle-aged man with sharp, calculating eyes and a thin beard, took a slow sip of his expensive Longjing tea. He smiled, though the expression did not reach his eyes. Your estate is as tranquil as ever, Lord Shen, the emperor began, his voice dripping with condescension. However, tranquility can often breed stagnation. A man of your vigorous nature requires a dynamic household. I trust you have made the necessary preparations to welcome Lady Hua. My father inhaled slowly. I saw his right hand, resting on his knee, curl into a tight, white-knuckled fist. He was going to do it. He was going to open his mouth, refuse the emperor, and doom us all. Showtime. Just as my father parted his lips to commit high treason, I threw my head back, took a massive breath that expanded my tiny lungs to their maximum capacity, and unleashed a shriek so loud and piercing it vibrated the teacups on the table. Wah! The sound was unholy terror. It echoed off the high vaulted ceilings of the reception hall, entirely drowning out whatever my father had been about to say. The emperor flinched violently, spilling hot tea onto his pristine yellow robes. Good heavens! He snapped, glaring down at me. What is the meaning of this? My mother immediately pulled me into her arms, looking genuinely panicked. Hush, Ling, hush, she pleaded softly. I immediately stopped crying. I sniffled once, batted my large, tear-filled eyes, and offered the emperor a sweet, angelic smile. I even reached out and patted my mother's cheek lovingly. The emperor scowled, brushing the spilled tea off his lap. As I was saying, Lord Shen, the Hua family has prepared the dowry, the auspicious date for the secondary marriage. Wah. I cranked the volume up to 11. This time I added physical theatrics. I stiffened my entire body, kicking my little legs against the silk cushions, and waving my arms frantically, as if I were being attacked by invisible bees. The sheer decibel level of my scream was enough to make the Imperial guards stationed by the door wince and cover their ears. "Silence that child," the emperor demanded, his face flushing an angry, mottled red. My father, who had initially looked alarmed, suddenly went very still. I saw a dangerous, perceptive glint flash in his dark eyes. He leaned forward, adopting a look of profound, entirely fake distress. "I apologize, Your Majesty," Shen said, raising his voice to be heard over my strategic wailing. "My daughter has always possessed a mysterious sensitivity to the spirits. The monks at the Great Temple believe she is attuned to the flow of the heavens. It seems something in this room is causing her immense spiritual agony." I almost broke character to laugh. Spiritual agony. My dad was a genius. He was playing directly into the emperor's well-known paranoia and deep-seated superstition regarding omens. "Spiritual agony?" the emperor repeated, looking around the room nervously. I instantly quieted down. I sat up perfectly straight, grabbed a tiny sweet cake from a silver plate, and took a polite, delicate bite, humming happily as if I hadn't just ruptured everyone's eardrums. The emperor cleared his throat, adjusting his collar. He looked deeply unsettled, but determined to force his political agenda. "Well, be that as it may, the Hua family." I didn't even use words. I just emitted a continuous, high-pitched, tea kettle screech that rattled the paper windows. I threw the sweet cake onto the floor and covered my eyes, trembling violently as if I were witnessing a horrifying demonic entity standing right behind the emperor. The emperor actually twisted around in his seat to look behind him. Finding nothing but empty air, he turned back, massaging his temples. A massive headache was clearly beginning to throb behind his eyes. "Your Majesty," my father said gravely, his voice laced with heavy, ominous concern. "It appears the very mention of this union violently disrupts the harmony of my household. If the heavens themselves are rejecting this marriage through the cries of an innocent child, to proceed might invite catastrophic misfortune, not just upon my estate, but perhaps upon those who decreed it." The emperor stared at my father, then down at me. I peered through my fingers, gave a small, terrifyingly timed hiccup, and prepared to draw breath for round 4. "Enough," the emperor barked, throwing his hands up in defeat. "Enough of this cursed screaming. Keep your tranquil, stagnant household, Lord Shen. If the spirits are so violently opposed to Lady Hua, I will not force a doomed union upon you. The decree is suspended indefinitely." He stood up so fast he knocked over his chair. Without waiting for a formal bow or a farewell, the son of heaven turned and practically sprinted out of the reception hall, his guards scrambling to keep up. The moment the heavy wooden doors closed behind them, silence descended on the room. I lowered my hands, popped another sweet cake into my mouth, and kicked my feet happily. My mother sat frozen, completely stunned by the rapid turn of events. My father looked at the doorway, then slowly turned his gaze down to me. The corners of his mouth twitched before breaking into a full, booming laugh that echoed warmly through the hall. He reached over, scooped me up into his arms, and kissed my forehead. "Spiritual agony," Shen chuckled, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. "You are in terror, Ling." "I am attuned to the heavens," I replied cheerfully, offering him half of my cake. The edict was dead. My father's head was still firmly attached to his shoulders, and my vocal cords had successfully saved our family. Chapter 13. The emperor's abrupt retreat from our estate was the final nail in the coffin for the Hua family's political ambitions. The capital's rumor mill, always hungry for a scandal, quickly deduced that the emperor had retracted the marriage edict because the heavens themselves, speaking through Lord Shen's miraculously attuned toddler, had violently rejected Lady Hua. Practically overnight, she became a political pariah. No noble family wanted anything to do with a woman who supposedly carried enough bad karma to make a 4-year-old scream in spiritual agony. Desperate, cornered, and rapidly running out of options, Lady Hua decided to make one final, catastrophic gamble. If she couldn't marry my father and usurp my mother's place, She would destroy our entire family and run back into the arms of the original novel's male lead, Crown Prince Li Wei. The Crown Prince was everything a male lead was supposed to be: handsome, righteous, and deeply committed to the prosperity of the Yan Empire. He was also my father's primary political rival, which made him the perfect audience for Hua's final scheme. A few weeks after the edict disaster, the Crown Prince formally visited our estate to discuss border taxes. While my father and the prince were locked in a tense, polite debate in the grand reception hall, I was supposedly taking a nap in my father's private study. In reality, I was wide awake, currently organizing my extensive collection of wooden horses by height on his mahogany floor. The heavy oak door creaked open. I ducked behind my father's massive desk, expecting my mother or a nanny coming to scold me into sleeping. Instead, a nervous, sweating scullery maid slipped into the room. She looked around frantically, failing to notice the 4-year-old hiding behind the furniture. With trembling hands, the maid pulled a folded piece of thick, expensive parchment from her robes and hastily stuffed it between the pages of one of my father's military ledgers. Then, she turned and bolted out the door. Well, that was incredibly suspicious, I thought, crawling out from under the desk. I grabbed a small footstool, dragged it over to the bookshelf, and pulled out the heavy ledger. The folded parchment fell onto the floor. I opened it up. It was covered in dense, elegant calligraphy that I couldn't fully read yet, but it had the red wax seal of a known northern rebel leader stamped at the bottom. It was a forged letter of treason. Hua was trying to frame my father for conspiring with the rebellion. Oh, this woman is exhausting, I sighed. I could have just thrown the letter in the charcoal brazier and been done with it. But planting forged evidence of treason was a capital offense. It was time to deal with the White Lotus permanently. I carried the letter over to my father's desk, grabbed his favorite silver-handled inkbrush, and decided to make a few artistic additions. Once my masterpiece was complete, I hopped off the chair and proudly marched out of the study, heading straight for the grand reception hall. The guards at the doors didn't even try to stop me. They knew better. I pushed the heavy doors open and trotted right into the middle of the tense political summit. Ling, my father sighed, though the icy glare he had been directing at the Crown Prince instantly softened. You are supposed to be resting. Look, I chirped, ignoring royal protocol completely as I marched up to the low table and slapped the piece of parchment down right between my father and the Crown Prince. I drew a ducky. My father looked down at the parchment. His eyes widened slightly as he processed the forged treasonous text beneath my heavy, blotchy ink drawing of a very fat, lopsided duck. Crown Prince Li Wei leaned forward, frowning. Lord Shen, is that a rebel seal? It appears to be, my father said smoothly, his eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. He looked at me. Ling, where did you find this? The sweaty lady put it in your book, I announced helpfully. She ran away. So I fixed it. Do you like the ducky? The Crown Prince went rigid. He reached out and picked up the parchment, holding it up to the light. I watched as the righteous male lead's expression shifted from confusion to shock, and finally, to disgust. The scent on this parchment, the Crown Prince murmured, his jaw clenching. It is plum blossom and white sandalwood. And this calligraphy style, the sharp hook on the character for mountain. He recognized it. Of course he did. Before Hua had set her sights on my father, she had spent years sending love letters to the Crown Prince using this exact, highly customized stationery and handwriting. My father calmly poured himself another cup of tea. It seems someone attempted to frame me for high treason using a very sloppy bribe, Your Highness. And they used their own personal stationery to do it. How remarkably foolish. The Crown Prince looked like he had swallowed a lemon. For years, he had believed Hua was a delicate, innocent victim of my father's ruthless politics. Seeing undeniable proof that she was a venomous, calculating saboteur completely shattered his illusions. Guards, the Crown Prince barked, standing up so abruptly he knocked his teacup over. Find the maid who entered this study, and send a detachment to the Hua estate immediately. The fallout was swift and merciless. The maid confessed instantly under the combined glares of my father and the Crown Prince. Stripped of her flawless reputation, and abandoned by the male lead who now despised her, Lady Hua was completely ruined. To save their entire clan from being executed for her treasonous forgery, the Hua family immediately disowned her. Under the cover of night, the original heroine of the Lotus Pavilion's secret was shoved into a plain wooden carriage and sent away to the most remote, freezing, and silent monastery in the northern mountains. She was to spend the rest of her days scrubbing stone floors in silence. It was, ironically, the exact fate she had originally intended for my mother. As I sat on my father's lap that evening, happily eating a sweet bun while he and my mother laughed over a game of Go, I felt a deep, resonant click in my soul. The villainess was gone. The plot was completely broken. We were finally truly safe. Chapter 14. With Lady Hua permanently scrubbing stone floors in a freezing mountain monastery, a profound, unshakable peace finally settled over the Shen estate. The treacherous political machinations of the capital suddenly seemed light years away from our daily lives. My father, the supposedly ruthless minister of the left, had essentially stopped working overtime, preferring to spend his evenings attempting to braid my hair. A task that usually ended with me looking like a startled bird, but I loved him too much to complain. However, despite the idyllic domestic bliss, there was one lingering shadow from the past that Lord Shen was determined to eradicate. It began on a crisp, perfectly clear spring morning. My mother, Lady Mei, was requested by my father to meet him in the outer courtyard's plum blossom gardens. She dressed carefully in a beautiful, flowing gown of soft pastel pink, a color she favored now that she no longer had to dress in the heavy, somber colors of a politically oppressed wife. I, naturally, was already outside, having been enlisted by my father as his tiny, heavily bribed accomplice. I was seated in a specially carved, miniature wooden chair right in the center of the garden, holding a basket of fresh flower petals, and eating a candied plum. When my mother stepped through the moon gate into the garden, she froze. The plum blossom trees were in full, glorious bloom, the branches heavy with delicate pink and white petals that drifted down like warm snow. But it wasn't the trees that made her stop in her tracks. The entire garden had been transformed into a breathtakingly romantic altar. Strings of soft silk ribbons hung from the branches, and a carpet of rich, red silk led to the center of the grove. Standing at the end of the silk runner was my father. He was not wearing his usual dark, intimidating court robes. Instead, he was dressed in the traditional, vibrant crimson silk of a groom. He looked undeniably handsome, his sharp features softened by a look of such intense, nervous devotion that it completely erased his fearsome reputation. "Shen," my mother breathed, her hands flying to her mouth. "What is all this?" My father stepped forward, his eyes locked entirely on her. He didn't look at the sky, he didn't look at me. The rest of the universe had simply ceased to exist for him. "Our first wedding," Shen began, his deep voice carrying clearly through the quiet garden, "was a transaction. It was a cold, loveless political decree forced upon us by an emperor, who wanted to use you as a chain to bind me. There were hundreds of guests, none of whom cared for our happiness, and we exchanged vows we did not mean." My mother's eyes filled with sudden, bright tears. She took a slow step onto the red silk runner. "I cannot rewrite the past," Shen continued, closing the distance between them and gently taking both of her trembling hands in his. "I cannot erase the fear you felt when you were forced into my home. But I can ensure that from this day forward, every memory we make is one of our own choosing." He dropped to one knee. The butcher of the Northern Rebellion, the most feared man in the Yan Empire, kneeling in a pile of pink petals. "Mei," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I do not want to be your husband out of duty. I want to be your husband because you are the only soul in this world who truly sees me. Will you marry me properly this time?" A choked sob escaped my mother's lips. She dropped to her knees right there on the red silk, not caring if it ruined her beautiful pastel gown, and threw her arms around his neck. "Yes," she wept happily into his shoulder. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They held each other tightly under the shower of falling blossoms, exchanging new, fiercely honest vows of lifelong love and devotion. There were no imperial eunuchs, no scheming nobles, and no political alliances at stake. It was just a man and a woman, finally claiming the happiness they had fought so hard to find. Yay! I cheered at the top of my lungs, shattering the quiet, emotional silence. I stood up on my tiny wooden chair, reached into my basket, and aggressively chucked handfuls of flower petals at them with all the might my 4-year-old arms could muster. A clump of petals bounced right off my father's nose. He blinked, pulling back from my mother slightly, before a massive, beaming smile broke across his face. He stood up, scooped my mother into one arm, and marched over to scoop me up with the other. "Thank you, Ling," he laughed, pressing a kiss to my cheek while my mother leaned in to kiss my forehead. Wrapped in the arms of my completely obsessed, hopelessly in love parents. I kicked my little feet in pure, unadulterated triumph. The tragedy was officially cancelled, the romantic comedy had reached its peak, and I had the best front row seat in the house. Epilogue. 5 years later, the once quiet, lonely courtyards of the Shen estate were filled with the chaotic, beautiful sounds of a truly lived-in home. The air was no longer thick with political tension or the looming shadow of imperial mandates, but instead smelled faintly of freshly baked osmanthus cakes, and the earthy scent of the garden where my little brother, Tian, was currently attempting to climb a stone lion. I was 9 years old now, sitting on the veranda with a book of advanced mathematics, a holdover from my past life that I still enjoyed, while watching the scene unfold. My father, the supposedly minister of the left, was currently crawling on the grass, having been recruited as a ferocious tiger in Tian's imaginative game. He looked ridiculous, his expensive silk robe stained with grass, but the booming, genuine laughter escaping his chest was the most beautiful sound in the world. My mother sat on the bench beside me, her head resting on my shoulder as she watched them. She was currently pregnant again, her hand resting protectively over her stomach, a serene, unshakable smile gracing her face. She looked vibrant, healthy, and entirely at peace, a far cry from the fragile, lonely woman she had been in the pages of that tragic web novel. "You are becoming quite the scholarling," my mother murmured, closing her eyes and breathing in the afternoon sun. "I am just keeping my mind sharp," I replied, leaning into her touch. "Your father is teaching Tian how to hold a brush today," she noted, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "He says he wants him to learn the grace of calligraphy, though I suspect he mostly wants an excuse to spend all morning in the garden." I watched as my father finally caught the tiger hunter, scooping up a giggling, squealing Tian and hoisting him high into the air. My father's eyes locked with mine across the lawn. He didn't look like a minister, or a villain, or a powerful man of the court. He just looked like a man who had everything he ever wanted. Looking at my beautiful, smiling mother and my devoted, ridiculous father, I felt a profound, heavy sense of peace settle deep into my soul. The plot of the tragic novel, the lotus pond, the miscarriage, the destroyed marriage, the executed villain, felt like a dream from a lifetime ago. It was a distant, irrelevant memory that had no power here. I had fought tooth and nail from the very first moment of my existence to secure this happiness. I had kicked, screamed, manipulated, and even thrown sticky rice at the heroine to rewrite the narrative. And looking at the life we had built, I knew it had been worth every single second. I had finally gotten the warm, loving, whole family I had always dreamed of in my previous life. I set my book down, kicked off my shoes, and ran across the grass to join them, ready to be the tiger's next victim. The story was over, but our life was just getting started, and I wouldn't trade a single moment of it for the world. That's where this love story ends for now. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more romantic twists. Tell me in the comments what will you have done. Until the next story, keep craving romance.